Hello, I am Lila Shapiro, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2020 Brooklyn Book Festival for a discussion with Brandon Taylor and Kate Elizabeth Russell, two authors of very exciting debuts this year. Brandon Taylor with Real Life and Kate Elizabeth Russell with My Dark Vanessa. Before we begin, I want to let you know that books by both authors in the program can be purchased in the link below. So hello, welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
So I wanted to begin by just hearing what your reaction was to the title of this session, Forbidden Love, and sort of like your kind of gut reaction to like that idea and how you felt like it related to each of your books.
Yeah, for me, I was excited, I guess, to see it because, well, the way that my book has been spoken about, I feel like for the most part, since it's been published, is like this is not a love story, or like this is a story of abuse that's sort of told through this main character who's really misguided and in calling it a love story. And so seeing that the title of this was Forbidden Love, I was like, oh, okay, so maybe this would be a chance to talk about the book coming from this sort of not just thinking of my book as a story about abuse, but thinking of like, how does this fit into our idea of a love story? So I was, yeah, it felt like a little bit of a change of pace that was welcome.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of startled. I mean, it's such a charged phrase, forbidden love. And I was like, I wonder what this is about. This is fascinating. I don't know if that's a context in which I've thought about my novel before, but I mean, of course, I'm interested in the ways that like love and intimacy are fraught and complicated, particularly in our contemporary idiom. It feels like we are constantly renegotiating like our relationships and change, oftentimes like coming to new realizations about relationships we were in previously in life, and now perhaps we have a different read on them. And so I find that just like really fascinating as an artist and as just like a human, the way that we're in this really volatile moment where it feels like people are recasting and rethinking through intimate and fraught, relationships. And so I think it's like really exciting too. I'm really energized by it, and yeah, I think it's gonna be a lot of fun to talk about.
Well, it strikes me like, because it wouldn't necessarily have been like the first way I would have thought of either of your books either, but it does strike me that like both of your protagonists really share like this way that each of them were shaped by sort of like society's expectations um, of the kinds of relationships they could be in, that they should be in, like what is permissible, what is like good, and the way it, like in their sort of adolescence or in their younger lives, and the way that those like that those pressures have carried into their adulthoods and are like limiting or not their lives in the present. I wanted to, before we really dive in, I wanted to have each of you do a reading and do a little bit of an introduction of your books, in particular, like sort of speaking to, framing the passage that you're going to read, and touching on how it connects to the theme of forbidden love. Brandon, do we want to start with you?
Yeah, sure. So my novel is about a young man named Wallace who finds himself rethinking through a series of concessions he's made to survive his life. He's a graduate student, and the novel follows him across this kind of pivotal weekend, late summer weekend, when he has to really re-examine a lot of his relationships. And one of those relationships that he re-examines is with this classmate of his who is, up until the novel begins, like always been a heterosexual white man, and Wallace has reason to doubt that definition, and as they sort of embark upon this like entangled relationship. And I think that the novel is like interested in exploring the ways that intimacy is complicated by questions of sexuality and questions of race and class and etc. And so the passage I am about to read takes place sort of deep into the book, around the midway point, when Wallace has just had a really shitty run at a dinner party, and he's thinking about his proximity to the white people in his life. And this is Wallace and Miller sort of together after the horrors of dinner. They turn to each other. It's different from the time in Wallace's apartment from last night when they turned to each other in desire out of not knowing what else to do with themselves or their bodies, when the outcome seems so uncertain. They turn to each other now of their own volition, and it's so easy. Wallace puts his face against Miller's chest, and Miller puts a hand on his thigh. They're just lying there. But you would rather be alone, Miller says. You don't want the hassle, I guess. I would rather be alone, or I'd rather be the sort of person who'd rather be alone. It's hard to want to be with other people because they just vanish on you or they die. I don't think I'm dying anytime soon. You could. It could happen anytime. I could die. You were so morbid. You're so, so morbid. I don't think I knew that before. My dad died fast. I'm sorry, I know, I'm sorry. People die before you know them, and then you get stuck wondering, what if, what if? My mom, well, I told you that already. I'm sorry, Wallace says, kissing Miller's throat where it's bristly and firm with cartilage and muscle. But I'm saying I don't plan on dying. I plan on sticking around. That makes one of us, Wallace says. You heard that shit at dinner. I hope you stay. I hope you leave, if that's what you want. You can't stay for anyone but yourself. It's strange. They say study science and you'll always have a job, and it seems so easy. But they don't tell you that there's all this other stuff attached that will make you hate your life. Do you hate it that much? Yes, sometimes, we all do, I guess, was what Emma was saying earlier. Me too, yeah, but I love it more than I hate it. But fuckers like Roman, Wallace says, growling under his breath, they make it unbearable. I still can't believe he said that to you. No one said anything to him, no one did anything. I wanted to, but then I guess I chickened out. Wallace pauses, stills in Miller's arms. There will always be this moment. There will always be good white people who love him and want the best for him, but who are more afraid of other white people than of letting him down. It is easier for them to let it happen and to triage the wound later than to introduce an element of the unknown into the situation. No matter how good they are, no matter how loving, they will always be complicit, a danger, a wound waiting to happen. There's no amount of loving that will ever bring Miller closer to him in this respect. There's no amount of desire. There will always remain a space between them, a space where people like Roman will take root and say ugly, hateful things to him. It's the place in every white person's heart where their racism lives and flourishes, not some vast open plain, but a small crack, which is all it takes. Wallace presses his tongue flat. Good white people, he says.
It's such an interesting moment to pick in the sort of aftermath of their first encounter, and now they're experiencing like this unbridgeable gap. How do you feel? Like, what is that gap? Do you think that they're experiencing?
I think it's that moment when you realize that that you can love a person and desire a person and feel in so many ways that they understand you, and at the same time that there's something that they just do not even have a language to begin to comprehend. And for Wallace, it's this really basic fact of his life that as a queer Black person, he's always going to be subjected to these weird, winds of racism that come out of nowhere and sweep down upon him. And Miller just Miller can be empathetic, he can be sympathetic, but like he doesn't have a language to understand just how fatiguing that is for Wallace. Like it's so basic to Wallace's life that Wallace wouldn't even know how to explain it to Miller, because it would never occur to Miller. And so what's happening there is, and I don't think that this is unique to interracial relations, but I think it's true to any kind of intimate exchange, that there are always going to be parts of yourself that cannot be moved into language. And it's the feeling of like you got to be there to understand it. You had to see it to you had to sort of feel it in order to know it. And I think that what they're experiencing there is one of those first moments in a relationship when you realize, like, oh, as compatible as we are, they're just parts of my life that are just going to be opaque to you because you don't even have the language for us to begin to have a conversation that would help you understand it.
Hmm. It's so interesting because if like there are ways that like society, like when you think of forbidden love, I feel like my association is like the things that society frowns upon, but then it's like these are also like the ways that these forces have been like so internalized in both of their lives that like there is an unbreachable barrier, but it's not as though it's like impossible to actually articulate like how, you know.
Yeah. Like if they could articulate it, like if Miller could understand it, Miller would be a different person and this
Mhm.
relationship would be a completely different, relationship. So in some ways the gap is like a manifestation of the fact of that these two people are who they are and they come from where they come from. And yeah, and so I think that, and I think every relationship has things like that, just the sort of idiosyncrasies of any human relationship has things that's just a part of that relationship, that because you are who you are and because they are who they are, there are always going to be things that you just cannot that you just can't undo. Like if Miller could understand Wallace perfectly, like Miller would not be like a white man. Like he just like would not be the white man that he is, and so perhaps they would never even gotten to this place in their intimacy. So I think that it's, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it certainly can be painful, those gaps, but I think it's true to every human. There are always, there are things that even I have blind spots for, that when in my relationships with people I love, I'm just like, yeah, that would never have occurred to me. Wow. Yeah, I totally dropped the ball there, so.
Mhm. Kate, do you want to go into your reading
Sure,
and
yeah.
introduction?
So, well, my Dark Vanessa, it's the story of a woman named Vanessa Y, who at 32 learns that the teacher who she believes she had a consensual relationship with starting when she was 15 has been accused of sexual abuse by another former student. And the novel sort of traces the fallout of that accusation that happens in 2017, and also goes back in time to the start of this relationship in the year 2000, and sort of alternates back and forth. But so, yeah, Vanessa sees this relationship that she had with this teacher named Strain. She sees it very much as like a forbidden love affair, and she sees a lot of power, I think, in viewing the relationship in that way. And it becomes, throughout the course of the novel, I think the reader sees more and more what a burden that that reading of the relationship is to her, and how isolating that is. But at the same time, the alternative to not seeing it as a forbidden love story, but rather as a story of abuse, that's a little too painful for her to deal with. So anyway, the passage I'm going to read is from the beginning of the novel. It starts on page 5, and I think this does a good job of showing how much effort is required of this woman Vanessa at 32 to keep seeing this experience as a love story. Um, okay. When Strain and I met, I was 15 and he was 42, a near perfect 30 years between us. That's how I described the difference back then, perfect. I loved the math of it, 3 times my age, how easy it was to imagine 3 of me fitting inside him, one of me curled around his brain, another around his heart, the third turned to liquid and sliding through his veins. At Berwick, he said teacher-student romances were known to happen from time to time, but he'd never had one because before me, he'd never had the desire. I was the first student who put the thought in his head. There was something about me that made it worth the risk. I had an allure that drew him in. It wasn't about how young I was, not for him. Above everything else, he loved my mind. He said I had genius-level emotional intelligence, and that I wrote like a prodigy, that he could talk to me, confide in me. Lurking deep within me, he said, was a dark romanticism, the same kind he saw within himself. No one had ever understood that dark part of him until I came along. It's just my luck, he said, that when I finally find my soulmate, she's 15 years old. If you want to talk about luck, I countered, try being 15 and having your soulmate be some old guy. He checked my face after I said this to make sure I was joking. Of course I was. I wanted nothing to do with boys my own age, their dandruff and acne, how cruel they could be, cutting girls up into features, rating our body parts on a scale of 1 to 10. I wasn't made for them. I loved Strain's middle-aged caution, his slow courtship. He compared my hair to the color of maple leaves, slipped poetry into my hands, Emily, Edna, Sylvia. He made me see myself as he did, a girl with the power to rise with red hair and eat him like air. He loved me so much that sometimes after I left his classroom, he lowered himself into my chair and rested his head against the seminar table, trying to breathe in what was left of me. All of that happened before we even kissed. He was careful with me. He tried so hard to be good. It's easy to pinpoint when it all started, that moment of walking into a sun-soaked classroom and feeling his eyes drink me in for the first time, but it's harder to know when it ended, if it really ended at all. I think it stopped when I was 22, when he said he needed to get himself together and couldn't live a decent life while I was within reach. But for the past decade, there have been late night calls, him and me reliving the past, worrying the wound we both refused to let heal. I assume I'll be the one he turns to in 10 or 15 years, whenever his body begins to break down. That seems the likely ending to this love story. Me dropping everything and doing anything, devoted as a dog, as he takes and takes and takes. That's it.
Why do you think this fantasy of their love is so compelling to Vanessa?
I mean, for her, I think it's impossible to sort of separate this fantasy of it being a forbidden love story from the sort of setting and context in which this relationship started and played out, where he was her English teacher, right? And so he's giving, in addition to the books that he's sort of assigning in class and telling all the students to read, he's also giving Vanessa specifically, he's feeding her texts, he's feeding her books and poetry. He gives her a copy of Lolita. So it makes her feel like she is living art, or she's living these stories that are like mean so much to her and obviously mean so much to him. And throughout the course of their relationship, throughout the novel, she's shown to continuously being, trying to like contort herself to fit the sort of image that he has for her in his head. And he gives her these little clues that mostly come out as him like sort of prophesizing her future, where he tells her like, oh, when you're 20, you're going to be like this, and when you're 25, you're not going to be married, but you'll be this way. And so it seems like for her to understand this relationship in the way that he wants her to, she has to see it as this forbidden love story that is, and isn't that the thing that all great art is made of, right?
Mm. It's interesting. It makes me think, in the scene that you read, Brandon, do you think part of Wallace's attraction to Miller is this like unbreachable barrier between them, like, or how does that play into his attraction?
I mean, maybe so. Maybe that's sort of true of every love. We're as drawn by the things that feel impossible in that encounter than, as the other sort of great, lovely things. I think part of Wallace's attraction to Miller is that, I think early on in the book, it's mentioned that they're the ones of their friend group who have the most in common, but because they got off on the wrong foot, all of those affinities just get buried and sort of shoved aside. But when they're allowed to re-encounter each other at the start of the novel, all those affinities come out, and it's like, oh yeah, we both come from working class backgrounds, and we don't have the benefit of our parents being professors, and so we're both kind of on the outside a little bit. And so I think that's part of it. But I do also, you know, I agree. I do think that part of it also comes down to Miller represents kind of, you know, the opposite of Wallace in many ways. Like he's tall and he seems well adjusted, but we find out that's that's not true. He's tall and he's like white and he seems like he's got it together, and he's like this sort of idealized casual masculinity that I think Wallace, like a lot of queer men, tend to glorify and valorize. And so I think there's a kind of element of the forbidden in terms of like wanting to be negated somehow by what you're attracted to. Attraction has a lot, I think, for Wallace to do with the capacity of the thing he's reaching for to utterly negate him. And I think he's someone who wants to be negated and canceled out in some ways.
Mm. That's interesting. I feel like Vanessa also has an element of this like desire to be erased and to be sort of like let loose from her body.
Oh yeah, yeah, and that sort of emerges in the novel, I think, through these scenes of dissociation that happen mostly when during sexual encounters, and she just sort of leaves herself and imagines herself sort of soaring through the sky, or sometimes she just like leaves the bedroom and goes and sort of curls up on the couch. And it's interesting. I heard someone, maybe in some review of the book, which don't read reviews of your books, but right. But someone describing Vanessa as just this like lack, right? This like empty space, because she's presented as a character who doesn't have that much going on outside of this relationship, both at 15 and at 32, because it's just sort of overtaken everything. And if this relationship isn't even the love story that she tells herself to be, then what is she, right? If that's all that sort of makes up her life and her character. And I think that's the really scary thing that she's sort of trying to avoid throughout the course of the novel.
It's interesting, like both books are also like campus novels, and there's a sense that like each protagonist has kind of like, you know, fled their childhood home in hopes of like recreating this like new fantasy life at school. And I'm curious to sort of think about that idea and how it relates to the sort of like inherent like repressed eroticism of like the campus experience, where you're all like together, and even if it's not a teacher student, it's still like there's always still something that feels like more transgressive about sort of that setting, with these inherent like power imbalances kind of baked into the environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, in my own experience, like the campus was the place where I felt like I could leave behind whatever restrictive definitions of myself that the home held. Like I always felt really like freed on a campus. And when I went to college, I felt like I got to sort of be myself, whatever that means. For, you know, the sort of very pat myth of like going away to college and finding yourself, right? And so I think that for Wallace, you know, he feels that he had to leave home in order to survive, and he gets to the campus, and it's a, you know, he feels like he can be himself, but then he finds himself trapped inside of a different set of illusions. But I do think that a campus is such a rife place for this sort of thing, this idea of like forbidden love, because like, you know, there are power hierarchies, and there are power structures, and there are power dynamics. But at the same time, the campus is where like the personal and the professional and the academic all get mixed up together. And you're often there's not much daylight between people who are in positions of authority to you and yourself. You know, like the experiences aren't as separated as they might otherwise be. And like the older you get, and the more you go through sort of formal education, at least in the States, like the closer you come to your teachers, like the closer you get to seeing them as peers. And for me, like that culminated in college where suddenly all of my professors were like, call me by my first name. And I'm like, no, I'm not comfortable. I'm not comfortable with that. That feels like a sort of impropriety. But I do think that campuses, you know, they are this liminal space where like the rules of sort of society are suspended in lieu of like, they're suspended, and so you get all these other rules, all these sort of very context specific mores as to like how you're supposed to behave. And suddenly it's cool to smoke with your teacher, and it's cool to sort of linger after class and have these like very fraught and intimate exchanges. And so I think that for Wallace, the campus is this place of like great freedom, but also he has to figure out how to negotiate a whole other set of rules of like social engagement in some ways. But I do think campuses, you know, they're such a hotbed of eroticism, both repressed and not nearly repressed enough.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like for Vanessa, like when she's first going away, like she also like begins with this idea that it'll be like a chance to recreate life, right?
Yeah, or just like start life, which because she, you know, her background is from, you know, living in rural Maine in a really, really isolated environment, which is the environment I grew up into. And so the feeling of growing up somewhere that it feels like the end of the world, like you're the end of the line before, you know, the Canadian border, like there's nothing around you, and the real world of people sort of that people live in feels like it's almost impossibly far away. I wanted to sort of instill in Vanessa this the idea that going to school, going away to this boarding school would be a chance to sort of become a real person. And then she gets there and that's not what happens. Not just because of this teacher, but also because she doesn't really fit in, and maybe she has undiagnosed ADHD, or maybe she's depressed. Like there's all these sort of issues that I think she's confronted with, but doesn't really deal with. And the teachers around her don't really help, and her parents don't really help. But yeah, seeing campus as a place for like teenagers or even like young college age adults to sort of grow up and to play at being adults is sort of one element. But then when I went back to school for my PhD and I was in my early 30s, I really started to sort of think about and observe the way that campuses can be a way for grown adults to sort of play at being adolescents, right? So there's this sort of like weird dynamic between the two where maybe kids are trying to act much older than they are, and adults are indulging in these sort of juvenile fantasies of themselves, which Strain is sort of the example, like the extreme example of how harmful that can be. But I think there's a lot of there's a lot of ways that adults can do that.
It strikes me that, I mean, both of you have written sort of first books that, you know, share all of these, you know, autobiographical echoes of your own life. And I was curious to hear you both sort of think about, reflect on, like, when you're writing about, you know, such like intimate and sort of difficult, like thorny, you know, subjects, like especially related to these like, you know, formative sexual traumas and the way they play out in your adult life, you know, is there a safety in reflecting that through fiction? And
yes,
you know,
keep going.
Yeah, like did you ever, like, I mean, we have talked about this before, but it's like, did you ever think about writing it as, you know, in some other way? I mean, I know this is a book like My Dark Vanessa you worked on since you were 15, so.
Yeah, I mean, it came out of me in so many different forms. Like it came out as poetry, it came out as a lot of journal entries, but primarily as fiction. But and despite the form it took, even if it was journal entries, it was still fiction. Like I was never beholden to truth or even my own like personal experience or my own emotional experience. I never was sort of limited by that. I always invented, and I was always sort of fictive in that way, I guess. But I do see, as a writer, as an artist, I see fiction as a space of freedom and invention. And I know not all writers view it that way. A lot of writers see nonfiction and sort of speaking their truth as the way to find freedom. But I just don't. I don't. And so the thought of writing this as anything other than a novel that just felt deeply wrong to me. But then it's weird because then you're put in this position where, like, I don't want to discount the personal in the book because it is incredibly personal. But I think especially when you're working with material that is so fraught or can be easily framed as like salacious or, you know, titillating, then and if you do like if you're lucky enough to do interviews for your book where people are asking you questions or readers are just curious and want to know like the story behind your novel, then the sort of weird invasive questions start coming, and you can't control, or you can try, but I don't think you can as the writer, to control sort of the parameters in which the autobiographicalness of your book is read. So for me, at least, it's been this constant sort of tightrope walk. But I mean, it's worth it, but it's not always fun. I don't know, Brandon, if you've had similar experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I'm basically the same. I mean, I do write essays, but I don't know. I write I always say like I write essays so I can afford coffee. Like essays are not. I don't consider what I do to be like real essay writing. You know, there are people who are real essayists who I look up to, and I have too much respect for their work to ever sort of put myself even in the same conversation as real writers in that way. But you know, I do write essays, and I have written about the past and my past. But I mean, as far as like writing this particular story, I'd noticed someone was like, why didn't you just write a memoir? And I was like, well, I would never write a memoir, first of all. Like, I just absolutely have no no stamina to write a long form non-fictional project, because I just do not believe in the strength of my memory. Like, I just don't, there are no facts in my past, you know. Like, I come from a family that was so emotionally gaslighting that like I don't even really know, I don't even feel like I know like what my parents' birthdays are or like who they were. Like, I don't trust the record because everyone in my family either didn't say anything about anything or they lied all the time. And so the story has just changed so much and so often. And so it's left me with this like a real sort of unease with my own memory of events or things like that. So I just feel like I'm always like, I don't come from a family that would enable me to write nonfiction. I didn't have a good enough life to be able to write nonfiction because I just like have no real sense of like what the truth is or what facts are. I just feel incredibly uncomfortable with them. And so I just have no desire to write about this as nonfiction. I mean, I also, my attempt to get my literary agent to take me seriously enough to let me write stories. And so I set out to write this novel, and I decided I would sort of take the surface details of my life and just like lift them whole cloth out of my life and put it on the page. And I would let the story change and mutate in ways that were necessary to tell a compelling story. But the starting place was something that I literally took out of my journal. I had gone to the lakes with my friend and I'd written a journal entry about that evening. And when I set out to write the novel, I literally just transcribed the first 10 pages of the novel are ripped right out of my journal entries. But then it becomes really, really fictional. And it was interesting having my friends in Madison read the book. And they were like, yeah, at first I was like, yes, I could say confidently who this was and who that was. And I could see blah, blah, blah. But by the time I hit page 15, it had become totally fictional. and I was like, yes, then I have done my job. Then I have succeeded at my job. Because, you know, I mean, it's even if you do borrow from life, and I'm convinced almost every fiction writer borrows from life, there comes a point when you can no longer be beholden to the things as they quote unquote happened, and where the work of the story has to take over, you know, like where the needs of the story become more important than telling the literal sort of transcribed fact of or whatever. And also just like life is much more boring than fiction, or I guess now we're finding that that is not, perhaps not the case. Fiction can't keep up with reality at this point. But at least in my writing, you know, I use fiction as a kind of virtual space to revisit moments in my life and to sort of try to get on the other side of the table and to imagine what it was like for the people involved, and to sort of think very deeply in a human way, like even if they're doing awful things in the scene, like what brought that person to that moment in their life, and like try to like really be empathetic and understanding toward the characters. So yeah, I mean, I would never write nonfiction. It's just, I write essays only for coffee. I try to avoid them at all costs. They're just really, it's really difficult for me in a way that fiction is not.
There is like a different empathy required, I think, in like the practice of writing or approaching stories as fiction than trying to write them as memoir.
Yeah,
That's
I
true.
think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think so. But again, like Brandon, like I would never write a memoir. I have tried writing nonfiction in the past, but I cannot stick to the truth. I just can't. Like, and so I'm always like, I'm like John D'Agata, right? Who, you know, who's just like can't be fact checked because he's just lying all the time. Or I love John D'Agata. He's not lying. He's being artful. But like, so I don't know, the way that I sort of think about fiction often, because my novel has been framed as autobiographical, and I've gotten the same sort of question, like, why didn't you write this as memoir? Which not just, my answer isn't just I would never write a memoir, but that would be a totally different book because this is a novel, because this is fiction. But I feel like I'm often, I end up feeling like I'm defending fiction, right? Like there's a real, but fiction, I don't know. I think it gives us something as a genre that is unique and is really important. And I often end up thinking about it as a space, yeah, to be empathetic, to sort of approach a situation where, you know, we maybe want to think of things in terms of like black and white, or to have a clear villain, to have a clear victim. I'm thinking about, you know, my own book and sexual abuse now, but with fiction gives at least me the freedom to, I don't know, to delve into the gray areas a little bit more. Whereas in nonfiction, I don't know, there's so many reader expectations that are put on nonfiction, not just in terms of veracity and truth, but also I don't know, the expectations of where the stories end up and what sort of you expect from the writer to be like healed at the end or whatever. It's a whole big thing. Also, this conversation reminds me a lot of the Alexander Chee essay, How to Write a Autobiographical Novel. So that can be like supplemental reading for everyone watching this.
Yeah, that whole book is a masterclass.
So
But
good.
just very quickly on the question of like nonfiction versus fiction in terms of like empathy, I mean, I agree. I mean, I just think that in terms of when I'm writing nonfiction about someone who is like an asshole to me, I can just like let their dialogue do all. I can just like put what they said in the thing and just like let the reader come to that conclusion. It would feel like an overstep to like psychoanalyze someone who is being an asshole in an essay. Like it just feels like, unless I root that sort of psychoanalytic framework like in my own sort of in the narration of me as like the narrator, it feels like an overstep on the part of the author to sort of impose what someone is thinking. But in fiction, like that's how you write fiction.
Right,
Like
yeah.
when you write fiction, it's about sort of doing that work of imagining what that person is thinking. And for me, that's the whole point of it. And so I do agree that like the cost to myself is like a person who has to inhabit those horrible ideas that people have sometimes. Like that's a high cost to me as the writer, but it does feel like the most important part of the work is to sort of give every character, you know, the benefit of their own convictions, to let them stand in whatever it is they believe in, even if I as a human don't agree with them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, also, I mean, you know, since both of you have written these protagonists that have these like unresolved sexual traumas from early in their lives. Like if you're writing that as an essay, it's like you as an essayist have to reach a point of resolution or like understanding, whereas in a work of fiction, like you can just let those events exist and you can show the way that they are stuck by them, you know, in a way that memoir like cannot really do as a form.
Yeah, I feel like I feel like yeah, I feel like an essay in which I sort of toggle through my unresolved questions and feelings about sexual trauma, like that's not an essay. Like that is a thing for me to share with my therapist, right? Like the sort of the impetus for like wanting to write that and show it to other people, like that's not an immediately clear, there's no clear answer right away to that question of like why are you showing this to everyone in the world when you write this. Like that's just not, I mean, it's interesting, of course, and it's important work for people to sort of sort through their feelings, but the why show it to someone else, like that question, I don't think I can answer right away in terms of like, here's an essay about all my trauma, I guess, you know, like, but with a story, like it can just be the whole shape of the story. Like it's fiction. You experienced it with me. Isn't that wonderful? So I totally agree. Like the burden of expectation of like my comp teacher in college used to call it the so what factor. And I think about that every time I sit down to write an essay. It's like, okay, but like why would I want to show this to another person and why not just a therapist? Like why, like what is the exegesis? Like what is the sort of urgent moral material here that needs an audience? And often I delete so many of the essays I write because I'm just like, yeah, this was just, I needed to write my feelings down. Turns out that's what that was, and this is not an essay.
Yeah, it does feel like fiction is like uniquely suited to like approach this particular theme of like forbidden love, like the fantasy of it, the costs of it to the psyche. um well, I think we're reaching the end of our time. Thank you so much for joining me today, and everyone, please remember you can order books in the link below. And if you could please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 15th year of presenting free literary programming. You can do that as well. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lila, and thank you, Brooklyn Book Fest. Thank you.